Hello, welcome to the second video in our series on Paul and households. In this video, we're going to explore households in Paul's church planting strategy, both how he targets them and how he works with them, with primary attention on the targeting. We aren't going to be able to cover everything in Acts concerning Paul and households, but we're going to look at a particular vignette that's going to give us a snapshot of how this works through the whole of Acts. Okay, let's start the story in Acts 16, or maybe even the end of 15. The end of Acts 15, Paul and Barnabas have separated. And Paul and Silas have started working together. And they've set out. Paul and Silas and some others have set out, probably including Luke, who's writing Acts. And they've tried to enter Asia Minor a couple of times. And the Spirit of Jesus has stopped them. Exactly what that means is not described, but it wasn't just, they couldn't get a visa or the pass was snowed in. Jesus somehow stopped them and sent them in a different direction. So the way he did this was they had a dream. Paul had a dream, and of a man from Macedonia saying, "Come over and help us." So he wakes up and tells the team that he had this dream, and they conclude together that God had called them together to preach the gospel in Macedonia. So they do this, and they do it with some intention. You immediately see some deliberateness, some intentionality. They get on a boat and they land in Macedonia, and they don't preach the gospel. And they go to another city in Macedonia and they don't preach the gospel. And then they go to Philippi, the central city in Macedonia, and there they preach the gospel. To whom they preach and how it happens is significant. It's especially significant in contrast with what happens later in Thessalonica. Before we get to the story in Philippi, let me tell you something about Thessalonica. Like Philippi, there'll be persecution. There's persecution in Philippi, and there'll be persecution for Paul and his people in Thessalonica. In Thessalonica, they're forced to leave. And as they go, we hear later in the letter to Thessalonica that when they left, they were worried that the work wasn't finished, or that the work wasn't finished enough that it was going to be okay. So they sent Timothy back to Thessalonica, worried about what they would find, how things would be, because they didn't feel like they left it in a place that was sound enough, whole enough, hale enough to be able to get on without help. That's not their emotional state about Philippi. They don't think that way about Philippi. So it's interesting to see what happens in Philippi that Paul seems to consider enough. Okay? So here's what happens. If you haven't read Acts 16 in the last couple of days, then press pause right now and just read Acts 16. I'm not going to read it to you on the video. Read it, maybe read it in a couple of translations, and look for the occurrence of household or house. All right? Now I assume if you're still watching that you pressed pause and read Acts 16. I really hope you did. What happens in Acts 16 is it's a series of two households. Paul typically walks into a city and looks for a synagogue, and there isn't one, so he goes down to the river. It wasn't uncommon for Jews to gather at the river to pray or read Torah if they had Torah, but at least to pray, to sing the Psalms, to try to persist in their worship practices. So he goes down to the river and he finds what's called a God-fearer, or a God honorer. It's someone who isn't a Jew, but has had exposure to the Hebrew faith and has become a worshiper of the Hebrew God. So she's down at the river. Her name is Lydia, and she is in textiles. She's doing very well. She owns a business. It doesn't say that her husband owns a business. It doesn't say anything about her husband, so he might be dead. But she's running the business, and she has apparently a place in the community. She's selling high-end material, purple. It says a seller of purple is what it says, but this is high-end goods for high-end clientele. He meets her, and they tell Lydia and the others that are there by the river about Jesus, and they decide to get baptized right there. Like, that's what we want. We want to follow that Messiah, the Messiah that you're talking about. So they get baptized, and she says, "If you judge me worthy, if you think I'm real about this, come stay in my house." Now what happens is that Lydia and her whole household are baptized, and Paul stays in her house. All right? Let's pause here for a moment. let's define this term oikos, because this word oikos occurs over and over again, and it occurs in reference both to the household and to the house. So in the first century Roman world, an oikos was a family, almost never a nuclear family, larger than a nuclear family. Their immediate employees and slaves, their business partners might also be part of that oikos if they're all kind of part of one economic pot. The business that the family runs, whatever the family is doing to make its living, and the physical plant of the house. All that together is called the house of someone, the household of someone, typically a male head of the house, a male head of the household, a family head. In this case, it's female, it's Lydia's household. So that bunch of people can vary widely in number, but frequently it's in the neighborhood of like 30 people, 20 to 30 people. This is a first century household, an oikos. It includes the physical plant of the house, the actual building, the gardens on the building, the means of making money for that family, that extended family that lives in or around that house, and then the slaves and employees associated. That's all household. Earlier in the book of Acts, when Peter is on top of someone else's house on an oikos, he is in a trance and he has a vision of a sheet coming down, opens up, and all these unclean animals. And Jesus says, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." And he's like, "I don't eat unclean animals. I'm a Jew." And he's like, "Do it." And he do it, and he does it. And then people come and they say, "Cornelius has sent us." And so Peter's like, "Well, I understand now. I've been calling unclean things that aren't unclean. God calls them clean. I got to go to these Gentiles who before wasn't allowed to talk to." He goes to Cornelius and he talks in Cornelius' household, and his whole household believes, and that's like 30 people. This is not an uncommon event in Acts. So this happens in Lydia's household. Then Paul and Silas are preaching again, and they get nicked and pitched in jail for preaching about a king other than Caesar. They're singing in jail. They've been whipped, beaten illegally. They're singing in jail. There's an earthquake, and the doors fly open, and the jailer's like, they've escaped. And he's going to kill himself because things worse than death happen when you're a derelict of duty. And Paul's like, "Don't do that. We're still here." And the guy's clearly been faced with power outside his experience. "What do I have to do? I work for a Caesar, and you say you work for a Caesar. Your Caesar's stronger than mine. He blew the doors off this place. What do I have to do to not be rolled under the wheels of his coming kingdom? What do I have to do to be saved?" Paul says, "Believe. Repent and believe. Be baptized, and you will be saved, and your household." So he takes them home. They talk. The jailer and his household, which is more than just wife and kiddies, the jailer and his household, again, large group of people, believe and are baptized. And they take Paul and team into their house to feed them and care for their wounds and look after them. And then the next day they leave. Now when they leave, Paul's not worried about the state of the church. The church at Philippi at that time was this: Lydia's house, the jailer's house, we'll say Oikos, household, equals the Philippian church. And Paul seemed okay with that. Paul seemed happy that was the church. Does he continue to write? Yes. Does he continue to visit? Yes. Does he continue to strengthen and support? Yes. But these two oikoi, these two households, comprise the church at Philippi. By the time Paul writes the letter to Philippi, there are more oikoi. There are more households that have become part of the faith, and then there are more individuals who have been integrated into those households. This household kind of orientation makes more sense also of what happens early in the book of Acts, where they continue house to house day by day. What that means is the way of Jesus was being internalized and practiced as households through the daily life It didn't just mean like special meetings were being held in different people's houses every day. It meant that the oikoi, the households, were changing the way they went about life based on the teaching they were receiving about the Messiah and the Messiah's ways, the Messiah's view of the world, the teachings of Jesus. Now, this doesn't just happen as like ministry happens to households. It also happens with or through households. And there's a particular household I want to draw your attention to. It is not Ananias and Sapphira. That was a terrible household. Priscilla and Aquila. Priscilla and Aquila. The woman's name is first. She's probably the more active member, but they made tents like Paul. Probably not like necessarily just camping tents, but like coverings for coliseums, all kinds of leather work. This is a trade Paul had. And so when he was in a town where they were, he would live with them and work with them. It wasn't uncommon for them to bring other workers into their house to strengthen those workers, like Apollos. They brought Apollos in and like helped him grow in his understanding of the Jesus way, so he was even more effective and accurate in teaching the Jesus way and about Jesus to the Jews, which Paul never really was able to really focus on the Jews. But that desire for the well-being of the Jews was shared by Priscilla and Aquila, and they brought in Apollos and trained Apollos and sent Apollos out. Paul would work with this house as a member of this household and live as a member of this household, and they would work together in the cities where they were. Some missiologists have even noticed how frequently Priscilla and Aquila are referred to as living in cities right before Paul gets there. It can almost be asserted that maybe Paul actually sent them ahead to set up shop, to set up house in cities so Paul could get there and have a place to work from, that's pretty brilliant, really. So Paul didn't just target households, he also worked from households. Even when he describes his relationship with Timothy, a primary apprentice, he doesn't say that he has worked with me like a student with a teacher. He says to the Philippians, in Philippians chapter 2, he says, "You know Timothy has proven worth how as a son with a father, he has labored with me in the gospel." This again is household language. Sons work with their fathers in the family business. The family business for them was the propagation of the gospel. And so Timothy has worked with Paul like a son with a father. This kind of familial language is extremely common in the New Testament. And in fact, it wasn't that common in the New Testament world. Family was precious, and it was the way you knew who was whose. And it's used constantly in description of the people of Jesus and the Jesus way. And it appears to be significant in the missiology both of Jesus and Paul. When Jesus sent the 72 out and the 12 out 2 by 2, he sent them out and said, "Go into a village and look for a person of peace, a person who will like take you in. Stay in their household. Don't go household to household. Stay in their household and work from there until it's time to go." This seems to be something very similar to what Paul did. Even in some situations where he would be able to get into a synagogue and teach. There's one account I'm remembering right now where he is in a synagogue and he gets pushed out, but the ruler of the synagogue, the leader, had believed. And so next door to the synagogue is his house, and he lets Paul set up shop in his house. And Paul stays with him in his house next door to the synagogue and opens like this sort of competing perspective from the household next door. So households, for Paul, are significant social units, both as receivers of the gospel and propagators. Hold on to that thought, and we'll move next to a conversation of oikos and ecclesia, the relationship between household and church in Paul's view of how the kingdom comes. Thanks.